This is the tantalizingly titled How to Get Better Outcomes from Your Outcomes. Some of you look as though you already know what that means. Some of you look as though you are dying to know what that means. The good news is no one is going to leave this room disappointed as I leave you in the very capable, hands-on hands of Mr. HUGH DELLAR.
God, dear. How do you follow an introduction like that? Hello, thank you all very much for choosing to come along to the dreaded after lunch session. I'm not sure whose cruel idea it was to have a workshop after lunch, but maybe it's better to have a workshop where you actually have to do a few things rather than a talk where you can just sit and quietly sleep away the lunch. So yeah, my name's HUGH DELLAR. Very nice to be back in Bucharest again, and lovely to be back at the Fischer event. Most of the time I do two things really. I'm a course book writer. Some of you may know the series I've co-written called Outcomes, available through National Geographic Learning. I also run an online language school aimed particularly at English language teachers, sort of C1, C2 people who are already really, really good but want to get even better. If you saw those flyers somewhere for Lexical Lab, that's me, that's what I do. So yeah, I kind of do a mixture of these two things. And what we're really going to be looking at over the next 50 minutes is some of the things that I do myself when I'm teaching with my own books, but also I think some things that you can do with whatever material you're using in any classroom, okay? I should also just begin by saying I predominantly teach adults. I teach 16 up. I don't work with kids anymore, apart from my own ones. And yeah, so, you know, what I'm saying is coming from the perspective of working with 16 up, 16-year-olds and adults. So, going to really be getting you to do a few things, getting you to think about the way you approach stuff in the classroom, and then doing a kind of compare and share and talking about some basic principles. And I think the first thing I wanted to look at is something that really, I think, is really important in teaching, which is just learning to do the simple, everyday things as well as you possibly can, okay? I think a lot of the time when we're teaching, we're kind of pressurized into thinking that we have to be reinventing the wheel, we have to be trying all these new and different kinds of technologies and things like that. But a lot of what makes good teaching really good is just being able to do the simple, everyday stuff as well as you possibly can. And one of those things is just knowing how to explain new language, okay? And being really good at doing it and getting better. I know the way I've done this myself has changed over the years, because I think when I first started teaching, I was nervous about being asked questions. You know, students would often ask me, what does this word mean? And I'd say, what do you think it means? And they'd sort of give me some rough synonym, and I'd say, good, well done. Or I'd just say, go home and look it up yourself and develop your student autonomy. And, you know, that way sort of getting out of the fact that I was a bit scared of answering it. When you're thinking about dealing with student questions, part of the problem is that sometimes students ask questions which aren't always as obvious or as easy to answer as you might think. What you've got here up on the screen, you've got 5 sentences from books. Yeah, what's happened is the students have seen these sentences, like, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? And, excuse me, always turn your phone off. Excuse me. Hey, at least I can't get angry at anyone in the audience for interrupting me with their phones. So yeah, what's happened is the students see these sentences like, do you fancy going out tonight? And immediately the hand goes up and, teacher, what does fancy mean here? Or they've got something like, we usually take new staff on during the summer months, and the preposition obsessed student says, Hugh, why do you use on here? Okay? So for these 5 different bits of language, these 5 questions, with the people next to you, just give you 2 or 3 minutes, how would you answer each one? What would you say? Okay? Give you 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll come round and listen to those of you who are speaking. If you're not sitting next to someone, don't be shy. Turn round, make a new friend. I say there's no trouble asking? That's okay. There's no harm asking, there's no trouble asking. Yeah? We'll come back to this. Yeah, it was funny because about 2 weeks before we'd had miserable meaning sad. Okay, so it'd be something like he's had a really miserable few weeks, or he's been really miserable since he splits up with his girlfriend.
But the weather.
Same word, slightly different. So, can I stop you there? I won't embarrass anyone so soon after lunch by putting you on the spot and asking you. What I will do is just talk through how I dealt with these questions, and then you can sort of compare yourself and see how similar or different it was. And I'll then try and make a few points about this. I think the first thing to say is students don't always ask the right question, okay? And often what happens is students notice single words, but they miss the bigger picture. You know, they'll focus on one word when really you want them to be looking at 2, 3, 4 words. So with fancy, part of the problem is often students will see this new word, they'll read something like do, I know that word, you, I know that word, you know, going out, I know that word, somewhere, I know that word, fancy, new word. And they'll look up the word in a dictionary maybe, and they'll maybe just write down the first meaning that they find. You know, I once had a class where a student underlined fancy in this sentence, and when I went round and said, it's not fancy, it's do you fancy going out somewhere tonight, they said, I know this word, it means very beautiful. It's like, you know, well, you look fancy. Okay, in this context, it means kind of very beautiful. Yeah, but it doesn't work here. So for me, the first thing is just kind of saying, yeah, it's not fancy. If you ask someone, do you fancy going out tonight? It means, do you want to go out somewhere tonight with me? Would you like to go out somewhere tonight with me? Okay? So it's kind of getting them to look at the whole bit of language, the whole question. And again, it's similar with number 2. You know, why do you use on here? It's not on. If you take people on, you employ them. You give them a job. Yeah? So again, it's just getting them to realize it's not just a random floating preposition, it's part of a bigger piece of language. And you know, phrasal verb, yeah. And the same thing with harm. You know, when one student underlines harm, often what they'll do is they'll look it up and they'll go, harm is like damage. It's like, well, in some contexts, yeah. But if you say there's no harm, no harm asking. Yeah, there's no harm asking. It means it's okay to ask. It's not a problem to ask. The miserable one was interesting because about 2 weeks before this, he's been feeling pretty miserable since his divorce, okay? Where miserable means sad. So immediately, when the student saw this sentence, the weather's been pretty miserable here. Miserable's like sad, right? You know, I remembered something, teacher. And as a teacher, you have to kind of go, sometimes, yeah, but not here, okay? 2 weeks ago, he's been feeling pretty miserable, yeah. But if you say the weather's been really miserable, it means the weather's been really bad. Maybe it's making you feel a bit sad because the weather's really bad, but basically it just means the weather's depressing, the weather's bad. And again, in the last one, it's not come across. If you say someone comes across as hot-headed and ill-informed, it means this is the way they appear to you. This is the way they seem to you. Yeah? So again, what look like simple questions a lot of the time from the teacher require you to kind of refocus the student's attention and to bring them away from looking at the single words and to think about language in a bigger kind of way. So, as I said, they don't always ask the right questions. And I think sometimes as a teacher, part of our job is to point out to students that they're asking the wrong questions, and to tell them it's not fancy, it's do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? I think another thing that I learned the hard way is don't try to explain more than the meanings on the page at the moment. When I was a younger teacher, I think, I would have probably said, oh, you can also come across old letters when you're cleaning out the attic. Or you might, and kind of try and give every possible meaning of come across. Now, I'm just focused. Right, I'm going to put the phone here. I think I'm moving around so much that I'm setting my phone off. I'm sorry. I'm probably calling random people I haven't spoken to for years. Yeah. It's basically just focusing on the meaning at hand and accepting that you can't deal with every meaning at once. Yeah? Maybe if a student asks you, yeah, but can fancy also mean very beautiful? Fine, deal with the question. But you don't need to try and deal with every meaning of fancy when really what you want to do is, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? I think you also have to be really careful of avoiding what I call the synonym trap. Because it's really easy to kind of say harm means damage, or harm means trouble, or harm means problem. Well, can you say there's no damage asking? No. Can you say there's no trouble asking? Not really, yeah? Maybe it's okay to ask. There's no harm asking. So I think you just have to watch out for kind of assuming that one word means another word and is interchangeable with it, because language doesn't work like that most of the time. I think there's also this thing, a bit like teaching kids to cross roads. When my daughter was really little and she wanted to start walking to school herself, she only lived 2 streets from the school. And we did this thing, like a kind of worried parent, making sure your kids can cross the road okay. So I took her to the road and said, okay, when you get to the road, you have to look to make sure there's no cars. And she literally just stood there like this and looked at the piece of road in front of her and sort of went, okay, Daddy. It's like, yeah. So when I said look at the road, I didn't just mean this bit of road. I mean, you've got to stop, look left, look right, look left again, and then you can cross, yeah? And I think it's like that with language. It's kind of training students to stop, look left, look at the words to the left, look at the words to the right, be aware of the fact that they may be part of a chunk or a block of words or a group of words together. And maybe you might have noticed when I was explaining, I'll often do this thing of, if you say there's no harm asking, it means it's okay to ask. If you say, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? It means, do you want to go out somewhere tonight? So I think it's a very powerful kind of thing to do when you're explaining. This just kind of, if you say blah, 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 it means blah, 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 blah. So the first thing is just thinking about what you do when you explain things. The second thing that I'll often do if I have time in the classroom is I'll give a kind of parallel example, okay? Where often I think when students ask what does a word mean, part of what they want to know is, can you show me how to use this word in a similar way to how it's being used here? So what I'll often do as a teacher is to kind of go, yeah, okay, here's one more example of how it's used in a similar kind of way. Can I just give you 2 minutes with the people next to you? Going back to these sentences, okay, can you think of, just off the top of your head, and I realise that's a high pressure question, can you think of just a similar example for each one? So maybe you're looking at it kind of going, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? Do you fancy getting a drink later? Okay? Something like that. Just see if you can think of similar examples for each of the words in red. Give you 2 minutes. Okay, again, I won't stop and embarrass anyone by putting you on the spot. I'll just show you some of the ideas I came up with and what I might do with them, okay? So after I've given these explanations, I might then just say, yeah, okay, here's another example. For example, do you fancy going to see a movie tonight? And I might also just write up or add on the board or on the Word document, whatever you're using to give students new language, a couple of possible answers. Because, you know, if you're learning the question, it helps if you know some answers. So I might just write, maybe what were you thinking of seeing? Or I might just write, oh, I can't, I'm afraid. I've got something else. Wow. One word. The idea, planned. I've got something else. On. Okay? It's one for the people who are obsessed with prepositions. Yeah? You know, oh, I can't, I'm afraid. I've got something else on. You know, what? I'm washing my hair. Yeah? We're not taking on any new staff at the moment. Hi, have you got any jobs at the moment? Here's my CV. Oh, we're not taking on. The idea, I'm sorry. The expression, I'm afraid. Okay, I'm afraid we're not taking any more staff on. It's a funny one because it often confuses students. You know, why are you afraid of me? It's like, it's not personal, okay? Again, I probably won't get onto the course, but there's no harm trying. Again, trying to think of other verbs. You know, there's no harm asking, there's no harm trying, there's no harm... There's not many verbs that go in that pattern. But again, it's good just to show them a couple of variations and how you might use them. The weather's really miserable here. Not here, but here where I'm from. Cold and grey and wet. You know, I left London and it was 12 degrees and raining yesterday morning and then arrived in Bucharest. Maybe you're talking about someone that you've interviewed for a job. I liked him. I thought he came across well. So you can come across as arrogant, you can come across as hot-headed, you can come across well, you can come across badly. Thoughtful and perceptive. He seems or seemed, take your pick. Yeah, exactly. So it's just kind of adding a little bit more to what they can do with the language and how they might hear the language being used. And with all of the examples, I think of them as kind of parallel examples. They're basically very similar to the examples that the students have asked about in the course book, but you're showing them a little bit more information about how to use that language. Yeah? So you're kind of adding value to their experience of using the classroom material. I know that in French cuisine, less is more. And in kind of minimal Zen design, less is more. In language teaching, I think more is more, actually. And, you know, you learn more language from seeing more language. And as a teacher, it's thinking beyond just the meaning and also thinking about when would you use this, what message is it used for? If it's a question, what are the answers? If it's a sentence, what's the next thing that you might say? And I think the extra language kind of consolidates the meaning. It helps you remember the meaning because you see these extra bits of language. If you just have fancy with a translation, it doesn't help you. If you see, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? Do you fancy going to see a movie? That extra language clarifies for you the meaning and the contexts in which you might use it. And you're kind of recycling, accidentally almost, recycling grammar, recycling vocabulary that they've met already. So you're giving students repeated encounters with language they've met already. You can always gap the odd word here and there, like I did there. It keeps students on their toes. For the students who already know the word that you're looking at, it pushes the level up a little bit. For the students who shout out, you know, on! And you kind of go, yeah, good. For those students, it's a kind of, I knew that kind of feeling. And they're seen to have shown you that they remember things, that they kind of performing memory. And I think the most important thing is there are no perfect examples, okay? There are lots of other examples that you could have given there that work equally well. The important thing is just the process and getting into the habit of doing this kind of thing, giving your explanations, giving an extra example, working with it. What I often do then is, if I've got time, and it doesn't work with every piece of language, but I might use the class to expand on the language I'm looking at. When I first trained as a teacher back in 1993, many moons ago, one of the things that I was told on my CELTA course was to do concept checking questions, okay? I'm guessing many of you were told this kind of thing. And with grammar, I think it's fine. With vocabulary, concept checking questions can be really weird. The one that I had to do on my CELTA was, he got kicked out of the team. Was he in the team before? And the students kind of go, yes. Is he in the team now? No. Did he want to leave the team? No. Good, so he got kicked out. The problem with these kind of questions is they're very boring, basically, and they don't engage the students very much. They don't go anywhere. Much more interesting to ask things like, why might you be kicked out of a team? Anything else you might be kicked out of? Who by? Why? Okay? When you ask those kinds of questions, you're still checking students understand the meaning, but there's much more space for interesting answers to come up and for unusual things to come up. You know, if you're kicked out of the house, who by? You know, could be your parents, it could be your partner, it could be your landlord. Yeah? You got anyone else? No? Your cat. Well, what kind of cat do you? Big cat. Yeah, hungry big cat. Yeah, so again, when you ask these questions, sometimes weird answers come up from the students. So if I have time, I might ask things like these questions. Yeah? What other do you fancy questions might you ask? So do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? Do you fancy going to see a movie? Do you fancy? Yeah, do you fancy getting something to eat? Do you fancy cooking something tonight? Okay. Do you fancy watching a movie? Yeah, okay. Yeah. And again, you never know what students are going to come up with, okay? Sometimes they'll be like the class comedian who comes up with them being like, do you fancy me? And it's like, yeah, because everyone fancies you. You know, so you get to kind of work with and play with those kind of jokes in the class. You might then ask, yeah, what's a positive? What's a negative answer for each one? So if it's, do you fancy getting something to eat? Oh, I'd love to. Do you have somewhere in mind? Okay? Or, oh, I can't, I'm afraid. I've got something else on. Sorry. Yeah? What might the other speaker then say? Maybe some other time then. Yeah, probably not. Okay? When do companies usually take staff on? So, you know, at busy times, maybe they take staff on during the holidays, during the busy periods, over Christmas. What's the opposite of taking people on? Laying them off, okay? Students always say, take them off. You know, logical kind of guess, take on, take off. No, it doesn't work like that. Take people on when it's busy, lay people off when it's quiet. You might ask things like, anything else that there's no harm asking? Yeah? So, you know, I don't know, do you think he'll let me leave early? There's no harm asking. Maybe when you're at high school, you know, oh, I'm too shy to go and talk to her. Go and talk to her, ask her out. There's no harm asking. You know, the worst thing that'll happen is she'll say no. I can't do it. Yeah, so you might have those kind of conversations. Any other reasons why the weather might be miserable? You get different answers from different countries. I had a Saudi student once who said, 12 degrees, cold and wet, lovely. Miserable weather, 54 degrees, sandstorm. Okay? So, you know, you think it's hot out there today, 54 degrees and a sandstorm coming in. You know, the guy said, like, they just don't leave the house for days on end because it's really miserable. What's the opposite of miserable weather? Don't know, lovely weather, glorious weather. How else might you come across in an interview? You know, you come across as very competent. You might come across as being a bit full of yourself. You might come across as quite arrogant. You might come across as very experienced. Think of 5 famous people. How do they come across? Okay? Can be very entertaining. Let students choose the people. Let them discuss how they think they come across. So again, with all of these things, what you're doing is you're kind of exploring the language around the language, and you're creating the opportunity in class for unexpected things to happen. Once when I asked any other reasons why you might be kicked out of a place, apologies for sharing this story. I was teaching this class of like 19, 20-year-olds, and I had this young Swedish guy in the class, and he sort of went, you can be kicked out of a nightclub. It's like, yeah, it's true, Henrik. By those big scary guys, the what do you call them? Yeah, the bouncers. Yeah. Why? For example, only example, throwing up in the middle of the dance floor. And it was like, did I need to know this? And one of the other Swedish guys went, first night in London, and pointed at him. And you know, if I'd asked, has anyone in this room ever been kicked out of a nightclub? Almost certainly no one's going to put their hand up and go, yeah, me. If you ask any other reasons why you might be kicked out of places, these strange stories sometimes kind of emerge. And you never know if a class is just going to give you a standard answer or a kind of weird, funny, unexpected personal answer. So again, I think these kinds of questions that you might ask, like any other reasons why, when might you, what might someone say if you, these kinds of questions, they allow a much more interesting kind of teacher-student interaction. They allow more space for students. The best questions allow you to look at the language around the language you're teaching. Because if you just learn to get kicked out, well, it doesn't go very far. You know, what happened to you last night? To get kicked out. If you learn, got kicked out of a club, got kicked out of a bar, got kicked out of the country, got kicked out of my house, by, and then a group of people, and then the reasons, well, you've already got more language to talk about the thing that you might want to talk about. They're not personal questions, but they allow space for personal answers. They'll often result in a bit more board work. You might end up doing a bit more writing as a result. I think that's fine. I think also the fact that it's personal and it's meaningful and it's engaging makes the language a bit more likely to stick in the students' heads. If 2 weeks later someone says, Hugh, what does kicked out of mean? You just kind of go, do you remember Henrik, first night, London? You know, it sticks much more easily because you've got something to connect it to. The examples involve more recycling of vocabulary, of grammar that you've met already. And when you start thinking about the examples you actually need, you realize that particularly in everyday spoken language, you don't need a huge amount of grammar. You'll notice none of the examples I came up with involve mixed conditionals, the future perfect continuous. You know, there's none of that stuff there because basically that's very, very niche language. Most of what I'm using is like present simple, past simple, maybe a bit of present perfect, maybe a little bit of past continuous, going to, will, maybe. But it's kind of elementary level grammar a lot of the time because a lot of advanced level English is quite simple grammatically. It's the vocabulary that makes it really, really advanced, particularly in everyday speech. So I think the next thing that's really important is just thinking about, what have I done? Noticing. This was something that Anne mentioned this morning, this idea of noticing. And I think kind of getting students to notice language is really important, but it's really, really difficult, okay? And I'm going to be talking about it a bit more later when I'm talking about using L1 and some techniques that you can use from L1 to L2 to help noticing. But when you think about noticing, I think it's important, what is it you want students to actually notice, okay? Well, you want them to notice the contexts in which the language is being used. You want them to notice collocations, you know, miserable weather, that kind of thing. You want them to notice colligation. If you want to sound fancy and impress your friends, it's a good word to learn. It basically just means the way that the word grammars, okay? The grammar that goes with the word. So, you know, in English, agree is a verb, and you just say, I agree. In lots of languages, it has a different colligation. It will be, I am agree. Yeah? So that's the kind of the grammar of the word, if you like. And you want them to notice the context, the words which go with the words you're looking at. And I think as teachers, it's important just to think about what is it I'm doing as a teacher that helps my students pay attention to this stuff? How am I helping them notice? I think one way is through board work. So if you're in a physical classroom and you're writing things up on the board, you can do things like underlining or putting a box round, do you fancy ing? Okay? And you can just highlight that with a red pen or something like that. Or you can just say to students, yeah, these words often go together. There's no harm ing, yeah? And you maybe just give a couple of examples and you underline those. So that helps. I think it's also important to do, and I know this sounds scary because students hate the T word, testing, but there's different ways you can test people, okay? You can do lots of kind of low-level testing. So what you might do is just read out sentences that you've already studied before, gap some words, see if students remember them. So maybe at the end of the class, you look, you think, oh, I've got 5 minutes left. Okay, close your books, put everything away, quick memory test. I'm going to say a few sentences, shout out the missing words, okay? Do you fancy out somewhere tonight? Going, okay, well done, okay? I'm not sure if she's interested in me. Go and ask her. There's no harm trying, okay? Just things like that, where basically you're checking, do you remember the words? Did you notice the words? And once students realize that you're going to be doing that, they start paying more attention to the words, okay? Obviously, you could also do that as a gap fill beginning of the next lesson. You could just type the sentences out, you could give them to them, gap some of the key words, in pairs, how many do you remember? So you're kind of making performing memory part of what you do in the everyday classroom. You can also do it with listenings or with readings. You can basically reread some sentences or some things from the listening, from the reading, gap certain things, pause, let students shout out the language. You can also do, the revision exercises. I'm going to be talking later about two-way translation, but I think two-way translation is also a really powerful way of getting students to notice things, particularly if students have got these ingrained, fossilized errors that they keep making because of first language. So, for example, a lot of students I work with will say things like, my father wants that I, okay? My father wants that I study law, something like that. Because in their own first language, that's how the word want works. So if you take a sentence like, my dad wants me to study business, okay? They translate it into first language. They then look at the first language next week, and you say, okay, can you remember the English? The good students will kind of go, it's a trap, yeah? And they'll remember, want works differently in English. The weak students will just look at their own first language version and say, it's the same. My father wants that I study English. And then they check the English, and they kind of realize, there's this gap that I hadn't noticed. So I think that kind of two-way translation can be a really powerful way of catching students as they fall into that L1 to L2 transfer. They can also test themselves at home. They can test themselves on Quizlet. When I'm learning languages myself, I always have kind of bilingual Quizlet cards, and I'll kind of look at the English, look at the Indonesian, my main foreign language. Very useful in Bucharest. You might then, if you want to push yourself, you look at the English, for me, and then try to remember the Indonesian. Much harder to do it that way than looking at the Indonesian and thinking about the English. For your students, the easy way of doing it is looking at the English and remembering the Romanian. Yeah, the harder way of doing it, looking at the Romanian, remembering the English. But again, I think kind of bilingual cards that test whole chunks or whole sentences, really useful, help students notice more. I think we also just need to think about remembering as being really, really important in the language classroom. Maybe some of you have heard this quote about memory is genius. If you haven't, I'd love to tell you who it's by, but I've forgotten, which probably says something about me. But obviously, when you're learning a foreign language, memory is the most important bit, yeah? And I'm sure you've all had that feeling. I used to live in Indonesia in the 90s, and my wife's Indonesian. And we were back there this summer for a month. And a lot of the time, I had that really frustrating feeling of hearing people using words that I remember I used to know, but I've forgotten, okay? And it's like you can remember that you used to know a particular word, but then you have to recognize that you've forgotten how to use it these days. And unless you're practicing it and meeting things regularly and having repeated encounters with things, it becomes really difficult to remember things. So this is why I think the low-stakes testing is really important. Doing all of these kinds of test and remember, gap fills, stopping, pausing, that kind of stuff. I think it's also just thinking about how else can we recycle language. So sometimes as teachers, again, when I did my CELTA, I was told, teacher talking time. bad. Student talking time, good. Well, there's good teacher talk and there's bad teacher talk, yeah? Good teacher talk is just called teaching. And I don't think teachers in other subjects get told this, like history teachers or maths teachers don't get told, don't talk in class. It would be really weird. As a language teacher, sometimes when you're talking, part of what you might be doing is consciously recycling and using language that you know you've taught before and showing it back to the students. So it might just be students are talking about their weekend. You just say, yeah, I had a great weekend. On Friday night, my wife said to me, hey, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? Okay, and you just kind of reuse a couple of things, and the students kind of go, I remember that one from last week. You kind of see the look of recognition on the face, hopefully. You can often do this kind of feedback where you're taking things students have said and you're retelling them or you're reformulating them. So you're giving feedback by saying, I heard some really interesting things. A couple of you were talking about blah, 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 and I heard someone say. And you're kind of, when you're doing that, you're using language that you know they should already remember. You're using that as an opportunity to kind of test and recycle. You might have gaps, which just test what they remember, what they know already. When you're writing the gaps up, again, it helps if you think they're going to know these things already. So with one of my advanced classes recently, we had this come up. Chuck that milk away, throw that milk away. It doesn't smell right. It's past its sell-by date. Okay, there you go. Bit of recycling, testing you. You get to show me that you remember that word. Yeah, I basically put my success to hard work. Put it down to, this is what I think is responsible for my success. So again, when you're doing those kind of gaps, it's a form of testing memory. It's a form of encouraging students to show you that they remember stuff. And I also really like doing kind of test and remember exercises, okay? And the way this might work is, say you've done a kind of, a matching exercise. You've matched 8 questions to 8 answers in a course book, something like that. Or you've matched 8 sentences to 8 follow-up sentences. You say to the students, okay, going to give you 3 minutes, have a look at the sentences, try to remember them. Students will always go, impossible. You go, nothing's impossible. I believe in you. And in a way, it doesn't matter if they don't remember everything, okay? What you then do is you look at the students and you think, okay, you're the stronger one, you're the weaker one. Sorry, okay, nothing personal. Someone has to be, yeah. You're the strong one, you're the weaker one. So, strong one, close your book, okay? Weaker one, read out the 8 questions. Strong one, see if you could, don't tell them that you think they're stronger or weaker, but you're doing this in your head. So you're going A, B, okay? A, close your book. B, read out the 8 questions, okay? A, can you remember the 8 answers? Probably you remember half of it. The weaker student has all the power, because the weak student can then kind of go, and correct you, okay? And so the weak student gets this kind of satisfaction of correcting you. What then happens is you say, right now, change, revenge, okay? Strong student has the book, weaker student has to remember the answers, but you've already had that extra couple of minutes of checking and testing. Students can then go home and do that themselves. They can go home, cover the questions, see if they can remember the answers, cover the answers, see if they can remember the questions. Next lesson, you've got an instant revision task that you don't need to prepare for. You just say, okay, just quickly, don't open your books, okay? If you want to make it easy, I'm going to tell you 8 answers. Tell me the questions from last lesson. You want to make it more difficult? I'm going to ask you 8 questions. Tell me the answers from last week. So again, you're kind of prioritizing the performing of memory, yeah? And I think sometimes in class, students kind of feel like just doing the exercise and getting the answers right is enough. I got the answers right, I got one wrong, fine, move on. And as teachers, I think we're sometimes guilty of that, yeah? We kind of just race through the material and we don't stop and check that the material's been digested, check that students have been looking at it, thinking about it, trying to remember it, paying attention to it. So any of those kind of test and remember things that you do, I think, are really, really useful and can be recycled over time. I think obviously practice is also really important, okay? Ideally, I think practice is best if it's personally meaningful. Again, when I was a younger teacher, one of the things I really regret, actually, is I didn't really pay much attention to my students as people, okay? I think because of the way I was trained, I wasn't trained to think about them as individual human beings. I was trained to think about them as producers of incorrect English, which I was there to correct, okay? So I could tell you, like, if my students could use the present perfect correctly, or I could tell you if they could say 3 trees or something like that. I couldn't tell you much about them as people, because the kind of practice I was doing didn't really focus on them as people. You know, it wasn't kind of personally meaningful. It was often kind of grammar games or weird activities. They'd have role play cards. They'd walk around saying, you know, haven't we met somewhere before? Maybe. Have you ever been to Paris? Yes, I lived in Paris in 1984. Oh, that's where we met. Good, tick. You know, I would do a lot of these kind of communicative grammar practice games that didn't involve students talking about themselves. And in the end, what's language for? Well, what are we learning language for? You know, really, learning a language is about learning to be yourself in another language, yeah? When I'm talking Indonesian, I'm still me. I still feel basically the same as I do when I'm speaking English. I want to talk about the same kinds of things. I want to be able to express myself in the same kind of way. So I think having personally meaningful practice is best if you can, yeah? Sometimes it's really difficult to do. So if you've learned something like, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? Well, the easiest way to practice that is just to write a couple of questions, walk around the class and have kind of imaginary conversations. But even if you're doing that, your students will localize it. So if you're saying, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? Yeah, maybe. Where were you thinking of going? Well, then they'll be talking about a Romanian reality, okay? Again? Is it? Is it really? Versus who? Okay. At home or in Canada? Here, okay. You feeling confident? Yeah, okay. And going to the game? Yeah, okay. The things you learn, okay? With that kind of thing, it's you have to do a kind of sort of artificial role play. With some things, like, you know, get kicked out of, well, maybe a more personally meaningful thing's possible, because you can ask something like, do you know anyone who's ever been kicked out of somewhere? Okay? They can talk about themselves, or they can say, for example, a friend of mine that's definitely not me once got kicked out of a nightclub, yeah? I think that makes it more sticky and more meaningful. You know this old saying about practice makes perfect? I would say forget that. Practice doesn't make perfect. There is no perfect. If you're lucky, practice makes a little bit better, okay? And then you practice some more and you get a little bit better after that. I think generally practicing conversation is better than practicing grammar in isolation. I think the problem a lot of students have is a lot of the speaking that they do in class is to practice particular grammar structures. And so if you ask them, like, you know, have you ever been to London? They can say, no, I have never been to London. And then just stop and look at you, okay? And it's like, this is a really awkward conversation. You're supposed to continue and kind of go, why are you asking? Or have you? Or, you know, and so I think thinking about what the conversation is a much better way of thinking about it. So if you want to practice present perfect, you need to show them a little model of, you know, yes, I have, or when were you there? No, never. Why? Why are you asking? Have you? And just get them to think a bit more about practice beyond just using the individual grammar structures. I think giving students kind of opportunities to practice English also just means being aware of opportunities for chat, okay? And sometimes these are the most interesting things in class. You might be talking about something, and someone might say something really random, like, Romania are playing Canada tonight, there's a big football match. And you might kind of think, oh, I've got 3 minutes here, let's go with this a little bit. And then maybe just get them to talk about that a bit, get them to look at a little bit of language connected to that. Sometimes it might be you come into class and students are having a heated conversation. in first language, okay? And you just respond in English and kind of ask them, oh, when did this happen? What was that about? Oh, okay. And just roll with that and learn how to use that and maybe teach something from it, yeah? And I think the practice means the feedback that you give is really, really important. When I was learning Indonesian, I spent a month once in Central Java doing an advanced language class. And the first week, it was really frustrating because all that happened was the teacher put us in groups and we talked a lot, and the teacher walked around kind of going, wow, really good. You guys are great. You guys are doing really well. Well done. And it's like, we're paying you for what? Yeah? Like, we could have this conversation in the pub. Like, well, why are you here apart from to make us feel better about ourselves? And again, as a teacher, I think you have to be thinking about this. What kind of feedback are you giving students on their speaking that's going to help them be able to have similar kinds of conversations better in the future? I mean, maybe a better way of thinking about feedback is feed forward, actually, because you're looking back at what they've done and you're thinking about what you can give them that will help them go forward and have similar conversations better in future. So I think one final thing to think about is just what you do when students make mistakes, okay? Again, it's one way I've changed dramatically. As I said, when I was younger, I was basically trained to be a kind of mistake detector, you know? And I used to have this naively optimistic belief that if I corrected a mistake, it would stop the mistake occurring again. Those were happy, innocent days. You know, and we all know it doesn't work like this, okay? If it worked like this, none of us would need to give up our time to come to conferences because you'd all just be sitting in class kind of going, not I have been there last year, I went. And the students would go, fixed, thank you. Obviously, it doesn't work like that. I also just think it's unrealistic to expect that your students won't make mistakes, okay? I've been speaking Indonesian 30 years. I would say I'm probably sort of C1 level. I know I make loads of mistakes, okay? I've sort of stopped caring so long as I can communicate and get by and make myself understood and hear what I'm hearing. And I think in normal, real communication outside of the language classroom, except in very specific contexts, mistakes don't matter. You know, mistakes matter if they get in the way of communication. I'm also a football fan, and one of the managers of my team in London, Arsenal, was a French guy called Arsène Wenger. And he lived in London 20 years, and even after 20 years, he never learned how to use managed to. He always used to say things like, it was a very difficult game, and we played our football, and in the 82nd minute, we could score. Okay, and I'd be watching TV, kind of going, managed to! And he never learned how to use that. Did it matter? No. You know, he was making millions of pounds every year. He was a really good football manager. People obviously understood what he meant. So I think sometimes just accept, you know, mistakes happen. I think have realistic expectations. And maybe the best way to deal with it is rather than kind of jumping on the mistake, it's thinking about how to reword, reformulate, show students how to do things better going forward. Yeah? And what I used to do was to say, that was great, I heard some really lovely speaking. However, I heard 10 mistakes, let's look at them. What I now do is say, that was great, I heard some really interesting things, let's look at how to say them better, okay? And psychologically, I think that's a very, very different message. You know, you're basically saying, you did well and you communicated, I understood you, I'm here to help you do things better. Sorry, that's a phone call I actually need to know because that's telling me to shut up. So, just to finish off, if anyone's got any questions, I'm going to be around. Come and grab me. I don't want to take over time from the next speaker. You can also just email me. It's hugh@lexicallab.com. Please do check out the website I run, www.lexicallab.com. If anyone wants copies of the talk or if anyone's got any questions you're too shy to come and ask, feel free to contact me by email. If you're on Instagram, please find and follow. I've got a personal one, which is HUGH_DELLAR, and then we've got Lexical Lab Teacher Development. Please do also go and look at the National Geographic stall and have a look at the Outcome series or any of the other books that might be of interest to you. And thank you very much for your time and attention. And if you're all still alive by 6:30 or whatever time it is tonight, and you want to be challenged on your ideas about using first language in class, come along to that talk as well. Thank you very much. Yeah.